It is a real pleasure for me as the president of the local chapter of the Society for Neuroscience to present our first inaugural lecture of the newly born local chapter of the Society for Neuroscience that has been dormant for many, many years until a group of our neuroscience students really got the ball rolling, and we have reactivated our local chapter. The local chapter of the Society of Neuroscience is now very active, and all initiatives are intended not to auto-celebrate ourselves and tell us how good a scientists we are, but rather is intended to bring out there the word of neuroscience and to show neuroscience to people that might be marginally interested or people that don't know anything about neuroscience and would like to know a little bit more. So the local chapter, it's open for joining. Any of you that are welcome to contact, and actually we need your support to do our activities that involve the community outreach and other different happenings, including campus seminars like this one that we're very fortunate to have had Dr. Eagleman to accept our invitation, because in the context of our wanting to be an association really outward toward people that are not necessarily straight neuroscientists, the acceptance of Dr. Eagleman to give us this seminar has been extremely fortunate for us, and we're privileged, as we will hear in a moment from our Vice President, Sarah Swinford, that will formally introduce Dr. Eagleman. So without any further ado, thank you very much for being here. Please join the society if you wish to, and I hope you enjoy the seminar. Thanks again. Sarah?
Thank you, Dr. Tagliatella. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. David Eagleman. Dr. Eagleman received his PhD from Baylor College of Medicine in 1998, held a postdoctoral position at the Salk Institute, and is now an associate professor in the departments of neuroscience and psychiatry at Baylor. He is also the director of Laboratory of Perception and Action and founding director of the Initiative on Neuroscience and the Law at Baylor. His diverse research interests include time perception, synesthesia, and neuroscience and the law. Dr. Eagleman is a 2011 Guggenheim Fellow and a Next Generation Texas Fellow with over 40 peer-reviewed publications. In addition to a career as a prominent neuroscientist, Dr. Eagleman enjoys a parallel life as a writer. His most recent book, Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain, is a New York Times bestseller and brings neuroscience to the public forefront. His other nonfiction books include Wednesday's Indigo Blue, and upcoming in 2012, Live Wired, How the Brain Rewrites Its Own Circuitry. His internationally best-selling book of fiction, Some, which is a collection of vignettes postulating various tales of the afterlife, is inspired and insightful. Dr. Eagleman gives the public a face for neuroscience through frequent media appearances, and his efforts to bridge the gap between common knowledge and advances in neuroscience are truly laudable. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Eagleman, who will present the Society for Neuroscience Galveston Chapter inaugural lecture entitled The Secret Lives of the Brain. But before we do that, I'd like to present Dr. Eagleman with a commemorative plaque from the chapter.
Sarah, why don't you get up there with her?
What?
Get up there with her.
Sorry, Dave.
Sorry, it's obligatory here.
Wait.
Okay. One, two, three.
So I lost some weight. Well, thank you. I'm going to put my weight off. All right.
Well, thank you guys so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm just up the road in Houston, and this is my first time giving a talk at UTMB. It's been far too long for that to happen, so I'm really happy to be here. Thanks very much. So I'm going to give a very general talk today about the things that I find completely amazing about neuroscience. And essentially what the most amazing thing to me is that we are the only species on the planet, as far as we can tell, that has grown so sophisticated that we have thrown ourselves headlong into this game of deciphering our own programming language. And this would be as though your computer started controlling its own peripheral devices and took its cover off and pointed its webcam at its own circuitry. That's the situation we're in. And what we find when we look under the hood at that circuitry, we find the most complicated device we have ever found in the universe. So this is the human brain. It's about 3 pounds. It is made of billions of neurons. Neurons are the specialized cells of the brain. Each neuron is about as complicated as the city of Galveston. Every single neuron has the entire human genome in it. It's trafficking millions of proteins. And each of these neurons is connected to about 10,000 of its neighbors. And what this means, thanks, Julia, is that we're looking at a forest of such complexity that it bankrupts the language. We have no way to think about something this complex, because when you look at the number of connections between neurons, we're talking in the hundreds of trillions of connections. So if you were to take a cubic centimeter of brain tissue, there are as many connections in there as there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So it's a tremendously complex system we're talking about. And one of the most significant intellectual developments of our species has been to realize that somehow this very complicated forest represents you. It represents your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, your fears. Everything about you is represented here. And how do we know that? It's because if you were to damage, let's say, part of your pinky in a car accident, you would be sad about that, but you wouldn't be any different as a person. But if you were to damage an equivalently sized chunk of brain tissue, that can change you entirely. That could change your decision-making, or your risk aversion, or your capacity to simulate possible futures and evaluate them, or your ability to see color, or name animals, or understand music. These are all things that we see changing when the biology changes. And that's how we know that this is the densest representation of you. Now, what has struck me really interesting over the last X number of years as I've been studying this is that all of this complexity is running, essentially hidden, incognito, under the hood. So if it weren't for neurobiology, we wouldn't really have any reason to suspect the existence of neurons and electrical signals, and for that matter, muscles and nerves and so on, because all this stuff is invisible to you. So when I lift a bottle of water to my mouth and I take a drink, that's underpinned by a whole lightning storm of neural activity. And yet it's completely invisible to me. I don't have any access to that, right? All I know is whether I got the water to my mouth or not. It's completely invisible. And what really started haunting me as I've been running a neuroscience research lab, is that essentially it's everything running under the hood. It's not just lifting a bottle of water. It's navigating your way around the campus, or driving, or recognizing a friend's face, or falling in love. All of these things are underpinned by these lightning storms of neural activity, and yet you've got no access to it. It's just totally invisible to you. And so this is what leads us to this notion of the unconscious, and it turns out that the bottom line is that the conscious mind, the part of you that flickers to life when you wake up in the morning, that is the smallest bit of what's happening in the brain. And the vast majority is all stuff that's running under the hood, below the radar of conscious awareness. Essentially, your conscious mind is like a stowaway on a transatlantic steamship that's taking credit for the whole journey without acknowledging all the massive engineering underfoot. So think about what it's like when you have an idea. You say, oh, I just had an idea. It wasn't really you that had the idea, right? Your brain's been working on that behind the scenes, consolidating information, trying out different combinations, trying things out, evaluating them, and at some point, it serves it up to you. It's been working on this for hours or days, and then you say, oh, I'm a genius. I just thought of something, but it wasn't really you that thought of it, right? That's the funny situation we're in. And so as Carl Jung once said, in each of us, there is another whom we do not know. As Pink Floyd said, there's someone in my head, but it's not me. So, I'll give you an example of this, because I just find this so fascinating. So there was a study done some years ago where they asked men to rate the attractiveness of photographs of women in photographs. And so the men looked at the photographs and rate from 1 to 10 how attractive they thought the woman was. What the men didn't know is that in half of the photographs, the women's eyes had been dilated with some eye drops. And so it turned out that the men uniformly found the women with the dilated eyes to be more attractive. But the thing is that none of the men said, oh, I noticed her pupils were a millimeter larger over here. None of them picked that up consciously, and none of them presumably knew that dilated eyes is a sign of sexual readiness in women. But their brains knew it. Right over here, they're running deep evolutionary programs that were driving them towards the right kind of behavior, but they had no access to what was driving them. And this is how love always goes, right? You find yourself more attracted to some people than others, and you don't know why. Well, the why is there are deep programs running under there. I'll give you another example. It turns out if your name is Dennis or Denise, you are statistically more likely to become a dentist. This is what psychologists call implicit egotism. We like things that remind us of ourselves. But here's the thing. If you were to ask any of these Dennis or Denises why they became a dentist, that would not be part of their conscious narrative. They would talk about how they like dentistry and teeth and whatever. It's a good profession. But presumably, that wouldn't be part of their narrative, because the fact is it's a terrible reason to choose a profession, right? Okay, by the way, you can verify this by going through any professional registry of dentists. Similarly, you can go through any county marriage registry and prove to yourself that if your name begins with J, you are statistically more likely to marry someone else whose name begins with J. And this applies for any letters. So Joel and Jenny, Alex and Amy, Donnie and Daisy. It turns out you can verify that there's a statistical overrepresentation here for the same reason. This has to do with implicit egotism. Well, that's a terrible reason to choose a life mate, right? And if you ask people how Joe and Jenny chose each other here, that presumably wouldn't be part of their conscious narrative, but the numbers show that there is this unconscious influence there. It turns out if your name is Virginia, you're more likely to move to the state of Virginia. There are lots of examples like this. It turns out if you're holding a mug of warm coffee, you will describe your relationship with your mother as being closer than if you're holding iced coffee. Okay, there are lots of examples like this. What this indicates is that there is a gap between what the brain knows and what it's doing under the hood and what the mind has access to. So there's a gap there between what your brain is doing and the part that you know about. Okay, so why is there this gap? Well, thank goodness there's this gap, actually, because it turns out that, let's take the analogy of a newspaper. So there's a lot of stuff happening in a nation at any given time. There's factories running and cops chasing criminals and people answering phone calls. You don't want to know that. If you want to know what's happening in the nation, you pick up a newspaper. And you just want to know the headline. You just want to know the big picture of things. Okay, well, that's what consciousness is for. Consciousness gives you a summary of what's happening in the brain. It just gives you a headline, and you don't actually want to know all the details. I think a good analogy here is like a company. If you're the CEO of a company, all you want to know is, are things going well? Is the stock price going fine? And so on. You don't want to know all of the details of what's happening in each person's cubicle and what version of their email program they're running and how the cafeteria orders their bread rolls. You don't want to know all that. You just want to know, you want to assume everything's running, and then as the CEO, you get to navigate the bigger picture with the sort of headline information that you have. So I'll give a couple demonstrations here about this gap between the mind and the brain and how you actually want the CEO to stay out of the picture. If the CEO of a company goes and starts messing with people's desktop software, that's the wrong place for him or her to be. And it's the same thing going on in the brain. So what I'd like everyone to do is pick up 2 dry erase markers in your hand. So go ahead and pick them up with your hands. Okay, everyone lift them up. Okay, what I'd like you to do is sign your name forwards and backwards. And I want you to try this next time in front of a dry erase board too. But go ahead and try this in the air. Sign your name forwards and backwards, your signature. Okay. Okay. All right, so some of you did better than others. It turns out there's an easy way to do this. Next time in front of the board, try it. The only way to do this is to not think about it at all. As soon as you're thinking about it, you're dead, right? Because your brain can't do that. But if you completely get consciousness out of the way, you're fine. And for any of you who play, let's say, piano or any sort of instrument, you know that if you start thinking about your fingers during a Rachmaninoff piece, you're dead. right? You can't do it. Your unconscious brain can handle this just fine, but it's the wrong place for the CEO to be if it's trying to muck with details at that level. I'll give you another example here. Okay, so everyone grab your steering wheel. Okay, you're driving on Texas 87, and I want you to make a left lane change. So you're driving, and I want you to move into your left lane. Okay, go ahead.
I just moved my lane.
Okay. As far as I can see, I didn't see anybody do it right.
Yeah.
First of all, I didn't see anyone use your blinker either, but that's so what I'm supposed to do is turn the wheel to the left and then back, right? Okay, so it turns out that's wrong. That would drive you off onto the sidewalk. The way to make a left lane change is you turn to the left, back through the center, just as far to the right, and back to center again. That's what a lane change looks like. And you do that every day, but you don't even have access to how you're doing it. Because the conscious mind doesn't even know how the unconscious mind performs very simple acts all the time. So one of the I put a neuroscientist's inside joke in Incognito, which is if you're ever playing tennis and you are losing and you really want to win, there's always a way you can do it, which is you just compliment your opponent on his serve. You say, wow, you serve so well. How exactly do you do that? And as soon as he starts trying to explain it to you, he's dead. He can't do it. So that's the take-home lesson. Okay, so anyway, so the point is that essentially everything you're doing in terms of your cognition is running under the hood. It's running incognito. You don't have access to what's happening there. So this isn't just how you think about things, but it's even things like your perception of the world, how you're seeing. It turns out that vision seems completely effortless to you. You open your eyes and there's the world in all its shapes and colors and so on. But it seems effortless only because about a third of the human brain is devoted to vision. There's a massive amount of machinery that's constructing the visual world for you, and that's why it seems effortless. So essentially, the situation is that we are like fish in water trying to describe water when we think about what vision is. We've never seen anything other than that. It just seems like you open your eyes and it's effortless. So it's sometimes difficult to appreciate what's actually happening there. But if you were a fish in water and you saw a bubble come up past you, then you might say, oh, there's something strange happening here. And that's what visual illusions are for neuroscientists. Is it's a bubble in the water that says, wait a minute, this isn't going exactly how I thought it was supposed to be going. As far as I can tell, the only people who are interested in visual illusions are third graders and the neuroscientists when they grow up. But anyway, this is something we're interested in because it tells us a lot about the system. So for example, if you look at that surface and that surface, you'd agree that that one's dimmer than that one, right? Okay, well it turns out they're not. It turns out they're exactly the same. And you can prove this to yourself by holding up your finger so that you're blocking out that middle part there. So hold up your finger so you're blocking out just that gradient. And you can prove to yourself, I'm not pulling anything funny there. All I'm doing is covering that up. They're exactly the same. This is an old illusion called the corn sweet illusion, where this gradient here, essentially the brain looks at it and spreads the information there to the whole rest of the surface. So what happens is you look at it and you believe that those surfaces are different. That's the reality that your brain is serving up to you because of this unconscious computation happening under the hood. And so it seems that way to you. Now, how many people would believe me that that middle square and that middle square are exactly the same color? It's hard to believe, right? But if I cover everything else up, you'll see that they're identical. They're identical. I'm not pulling anything funny here except for just covering those up. What's going on is that your brain looks at all the surrounding colors and the lighting, the shadow, and it makes its computations, again, totally under the hood about what it thinks is going on there, and it serves up a story to you about what it thinks the colors are. It's making its best guess. It's typically adaptive, but it turns out it's incorrect. But the problem is you just accept whatever gets served up to you. Now, it turns out you don't even see most of what hits your eyes. Some of you may have seen this sort of example before, but for those who haven't, it's worth it. I'm going to show you two pictures. I'm going to show you version A of the picture and version B, and I want you to raise your hand. Don't say anything. Just raise your hand when you see what the difference is between the two photographs. So raise your hand when you see the difference between A and B. Okay, only 2 people so far. 3. Okay, about 15%. All right, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's the rail in the back that's moving a foot every time. Right? It's a huge change in visual scene. You're looking at it. It's sitting on your retina. the whole time, and yet you weren't even aware of it. Why? Because it turns out that vision is not like a camera. You're not just taking in the world and observing it. I'll tell you more about that in a second, but first I'll give a second shot to those who failed the first time. Okay, so version A and B, raise your hand when you see what the difference is. Okay, a few of you got an A.
Oh, yeah.
All right, for those of you who haven't seen, it's just a 10,000-pound jet engine. Okay, so how could that be sitting right on your retina and you don't even see it? Well, it turns out that vision isn't what you think it is. It's not that it's not just photons hitting the retina and you're analyzing it and you're seeing what's out there. It turns out vision is much more interesting and tricky than that. What it really is about is internal activity inside your head. You've got a visual system that's generating its own guesses about what it's seeing out there. You have an internal model about what you think is going on out there. And you have a little bit of data that's dribbling in through these two holes in your skull. And that data is only coming in to confirm or update what's going on with your internal model. So for example, I have an internal model right now that I'm in an auditorium, there's a bunch of people, but it's not until I ask a particular question, like what color is your sweater, that I actually pull that into my internal model. Before I ask the question, I'm not even aware of the answer. And that's what it is with everything in your life. You're not aware of things until you ask the question. So for example, if I ask you what is the position of your tongue in your mouth right now, you can answer that, but you weren't aware of it before I asked, even though the same sensory data is coming up. Okay, so the key about all this is, no matter what your brain is telling you, you're seeing in the outside, whether it tells you the surfaces are different, or those colors are different, whatever it is, you accept the reality presented to you, and you assume, all right, well, that's what the outside world is. Okay, so for example, this is a picture I took in India recently, and this is what you would accept as reality if you were colorblind. If you're not colorblind, then you'd accept reality to be that. Either way, you take it, you take that to be what the outside world is. It's now known that probably 15% of the female population has not just 3 types of color photoreceptors in their eye, but they have a 4th type. They are what's called tetrachromatic. And so that means that those females in the audience are seeing this in a way that the rest of us aren't. And we can't even imagine what it's like, right? Because we're not discriminating colors that they can. So all of this leads to an old philosophical conundrum that many of you have probably asked some late night in your dorm room or something, where you say, how do you actually know that what I see as blue inside my head is what you're seeing as blue inside your head? Right? How do we know that our internal experience isn't different, given that all we really need is to negotiate and transact in the outside world? All we need to do is agree on the label. So as long as my mother taught me to call this blue, and your mother taught you to call this blue, it doesn't matter if on the inside of our heads it's something quite different in terms of the internal experience. Well, it turns out it's a lot worse than that. What I call reality and what you call reality can be completely different. I might see the whole world upside down from the way you do, and it wouldn't matter, right, as long as we can transact and negotiate in the outside world. Now, this used to be the kind of thing that was in the realm of philosophical speculation. Lately, we've been able to elevate this to a real scientific problem, and I'll just give you a quick overview of one of the ways we do this in my laboratory. So we study synesthesia. Everyone's heard the term anesthesia, which means no feeling. Synesthesia means joined feeling. It's a blending of the senses. So what happens with somebody with synesthesia is that they actually, one type of sensory input will trigger an anomalous sensory experience. So in this example here, it would be taste to a visual experience. So synesthesia is automatic and involuntary and unconscious, and it's and again, it's where one sense is triggering another. So that's all the animal research I'm going to show. In humans, here's an example of the most common type of synesthesia, which we call colored sequence synesthesia. And this is where things like letters of the alphabet or numbers or weekdays or months will trigger a color experience. So for this particular synesthete, V is green, and Friday is red, and August is green. And it's just self-evidently true to the synesthete that when she hears Friday, she has an internal experience of red. And when she sees August or hears August, thinks about August, there's a green experience for her. it's self-evidently true that those are the same thing. They are linked. Now, synesthesia it's unique for each person, so if someone else has synesthesia, there'll be different colors to it. Now, I mentioned it's unconscious and involuntary and automatic. For a long time, synesthesia was not studied because people thought, well, how do you know that they're not just being artistic or metaphorical or making it up? We now know it's a genuine perceptual phenomenon. I'll show you some of that in just a moment. And we also know that it's much more common than it used to be thought. So originally it was estimated to be 1 in 20,000. We now know that it's up to 4% of the population has synesthesia. So it's actually quite common. There are many different forms of synesthesia. Having colored sequences is the most common, but there are many others. For example, where an auditory experience will lead to vision. So this happens to be an artist who, whenever her furnace kicks on and goes whoosh, this is what she sees physically. She's, again, not being metaphorical about this. This is the visual experience that she has because her auditory system is actually cross-talking with her visual system. So this is what she experiences visually. There are people who taste shapes. So this gentleman, for example, when he puts a taste in his mouth, he feels it. There's a tactile experience on his fingertips. And this is how he cooks. He knows that the chicken is ready when it feels pointy and so on. He knows exactly how to judge his tastes by the way that it feels in his fingers. Musical colors is a very common one where people will have different pitches being colored. Here's the description from one synesthete of her different colors for the pitches. And for all synesthetes, the pitches are the colors are very specific. It's not that, it's not generally that someone would say, August is green, like I said before, but they would say, well, August is this particular shade of green. It's not like this. It's not Kelly green, but it's more like this. They have a very specific experience that they have every time they see it. Same with music. It turns out there are many, many forms of synesthesia. One of my colleagues lately has estimated that there might be as many as 152 different reported forms of synesthesia, and essentially any kind of crosstalk you can imagine, we found somewhere. So taste, vision, smell, touch, all these things can crosstalk with one another, leading to different forms of sensory experience, and leading to different forms of internal reality. So this is one of the things I want to emphasize, is that for a synesthete, some people, 4% of the people sitting in this audience will be synesthetes, and they're having a different internal experience than you are if you're not a synesthete. But the thing is, we all accept the reality that's presented to us. And so what generally happens is people will go through their whole lives, synesthetes will live and die without ever knowing that there's something different about them than the person sitting next to them. Why? Because we accept our reality. You don't always talk about the things that you're experiencing, and so we all assume that everyone has the same internal experience. This is, by the way, very common for people who are colorblind to not ever realize that they're colorblind because they just think that's reality. And presumably for tetrachromatic women throughout history, they might have fights with their spouses about what colors he's choosing or something, but they don't know that he's not actually seeing the same colors that they are. Okay, synesthesia's it's been quite often in the artistic community leveraged. So Kandinsky, for example, had music to color synesthesia, so he would crank up his phonograph and stand in front of his canvas and paint what he was experiencing when he listened to music, classical music. Many composers are synesthetic. For those of you who know Messiaen, he's just one example of many, but he sets out to paint the visible world in sound. He would describe these cascades of chords and color. As I mentioned, for every synesthete, it's different what sounds correspond to what. So another synesthetic musician would think that same cascade of chords is not blue-orange, but instead of different colors. In any case, that's what he used in his compositions. Now, I want to come back around to this point that I raised, which is, okay, how do you know if somebody's telling the truth, if they're claiming to be a synesthete? So one of the things that my lab developed was consistency tests so let's say what we do is we present you with let's say you have colored letters and numbers. We present you with a single letter of the alphabet, and by pulling on this slider and on this slider here, you can capture any hue and saturation. So you can capture any one of 16 million different colors that can be presented on a computer screen. And we say, please choose the color that best matches your synesthetic perception for T. And so you go through and you find exactly the right shade of color, and then we randomly pair you with the next grapheme, like the number 3. And you go through and you find exactly your color experience for that, and so on. And what we do is we present you with each letter and number 3 times each in random order. And so the idea is if you're a real synesthete, then the next time I present you with T, it'll be no problem for you to find exactly the right color out of 16 million different colors that matches your synesthetic percept. And so when we measure a synesthete, what I'm doing here is I'm plotting the letter in the color that was chosen. This is a typical synesthete's result. With controls, we say, look, use free association, use memory, anything you want, and try to remember what colors went with which letters. And it's really difficult, it turns out, if you're malingering. And so what I'm doing here is plotting, the colors they chose, and the length of the bar here represents the variability in color space. And so by adding up the variability, we can score these things, we can rigorously quantify these things, and sensitively discriminate real synesthetes from control subjects. We actually have several layers of more tests that we do, but this is sort of the heart of it. It's measuring internal consistency because synesthetes always have the same experience and control subjects do not. So we were able to leverage principles like this and make an online website, synesthete.org, which has really changed the field a lot, because what we can do now is have a standard way of scoring and quantifying synesthesia. All the labs in the world who are studying synesthesia use our testing system now. We've translated it into 8 different languages, including ones with very interesting alphabets and so on. We can test many different forms of synesthesia. Here I'm showing weekdays and months and Chinese numerals and notes and instrument timbres, and we have many others. And the reason this has been important is because, so when I first got into synesthesia about 9 years ago, I recognized it as a very powerful inroad into understanding how the brain constructs reality. Because what we're talking about with synesthesia is just a small change in the brain, which I'll get to in a moment, small change, and suddenly you're seeing reality differently than your neighbor. So when I got into this field, most of the papers had a single subject in it, an N of 1, where somebody would say, hey, we found a synesthete, and we interviewed her, we asked these questions, here's what we found. And then, some people had papers with 2 or 4 subjects in it. But what we have now is over 20,000 rigorously verified synesthetes. And what we've been able to do with this is really work out the behavior and the genetics and neuroscience in a way that has changed the field a lot. And it's all because we've been able to put these sorts of tests online and have people come to us, and that's been very fruitful. So, for example, one of the things we do in my lab is neuroimaging. And most of you are probably familiar with this, but those who aren't, it's a way for us to peer non-invasively into the skull and see where the activity is. And so we put synesthetes in the scanner, we show them letters and numbers, we show them pseudographemes that don't inspire color experience and so on. And I'll summarize in just a cartoon what my lab and other labs have found. What I'm showing here is an unusual picture of the brain. This is from the underside with the cerebellum removed. And the reason I'm showing that unusual view is because I need to show you this area that's involved in letters and numbers in the brain, and there's other areas involved in color. And what happens in synesthesia is that these areas are physically connected more to one another. So what happens is when a synesthete sees a letter or a number, there's a physical connection, and you kindle activity in the areas of the brain involved in color. So it's a genuine perceptual experience. They're not just being poetic about it, they're actually seeing color and having this internal experience. And so this is the same principle that applies for any crosstalk in the brain. If it's taste to touch or hearing to vision or whatever, what's happening is there's physical crosstalk happening. Now, one of the issues in the field is to figure out whether it's because of increased wiring in the brain or instead whether it has to do with a balance of inhibition and excitation. Personally, I favor the idea that it is the balance of inhibition and excitation that's going on. And the reason is there's drug-induced synesthesia, so non-synesthetes can take LSD or DMT and experience this, which indicates the wiring is already there. Also, non-synesthetes can experience synesthesia if they're very fatigued. Right when they're falling asleep, somebody slams the door, they can have a an experience of color. So these are the reasons why I think it has to do with inhibition. But there's only one way to find out for sure. And what was originally mentioned in a Nature paper in 1880 and has not been picked up since then is that synesthesia seems to run in family trees. This was noted by Sir Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, and it turns out he was correct in his observation that it does run in families. So what we've been doing for about 6 years now is finding lots of families where synesthesia moves through the tree. We've been collecting up the DNA from these families. In fact, one of my students and I crashed a wedding where the whole family was together. We got everyone spit kits. And what we've been doing is what's called a family linkage analysis, where we can figure out exactly how synesthesia marches through the family tree and how the genetic changes follow that. And so what we just published recently is we found a region on chromosome 16 that at least in some families seems to be linked to this. We haven't found the gene yet, but ask me again in about 4 months, because we're doing whole exome sequencing now, and we should be there very soon. Part of the reason I'm very excited about this is because it'll be the first hit in what I'm calling perceptual genomics, which is to say everybody's pulling genes for predisposition to diabetes or aortic stenosis or things like that. But what I'm very interested in is how do the small genetic changes between people translate into how their brains construct reality, into what they think is actually happening in the outside world. Because what it appears that we're going to find is that synesthesia is due to some small change, maybe a single nucleotide change. And suddenly your interpretation of the world is different than someone else's. I find that fascinating. And so this is what will hopefully become a new field of perceptual genomics. Okay, I'm going to take a 1-second tangent here to tell you about a tribe that was recently found in South America. And this tribe has 2 different symbols. One of their symbols they call Kiki, and one they call Buba. And my question for you is, which do you think is which? How many people think this is Kiki and that's Buba? How many people think that's Kiki and that's Buba? Okay. So it turns out I lied. There's no South American tribe. This is an old psychology experiment from the 1960s. And the really weird part is that everybody always thinks that that's Buba and that's Kiki. And that's funny, right? Because all that you're being shown is a shape, and yet it just seems self-evidently true to you that one should map onto a particular sound and another to another sound. Well, this has led people to the idea that maybe synesthesia exists in everybody somehow, in the sense that with anatomical tracing techniques, it's now completely clear that there's a lot of crosstalk in the brain physically. You have visual fibers that go to your visual cortex, but you also have visual fibers that peel off and slam into the auditory cortex. And you have auditory fibers that are slamming into visual cortex and somatosensory cortex. Everything is connected. Usually, in 96% of the population, these connections are masked, meaning they're not actually functional. You're not getting anything out of those connections. But it appears that what's happening is that in some percentage of the population, these connections running under the hood are actually popping above the level of conscious awareness. And they're aware of these connections that are happening down low. But it turns out it's very easy to demonstrate that we all have these connections with things like this. Or if I were to take a piano and I were to hit the high note, ding, 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 and low note, boom, boom, boom. If I were to ask you which one is brighter, what would you say? Okay, what if I asked you which one is bigger? Okay. So this is funny, right? Because all I'm doing is playing a note, and you're talking about brightness and size. Like, it doesn't make sense, right? Except that these are synesthetic-like connections that are happening in the brain that seems to be connected with everybody. And so one thing that's been speculated is this might somehow be the basis of metaphor and creativity, because what metaphor is making connections across different domains. For example, Shakespeare was terrific at taking things in the emotional domain and mapping them onto something in the physical domain. And there's a lot in our language that appears to be synesthetic. If you talk about a loud tie, or cool jazz, or sharp cheese, things like this, these are all synesthetic metaphors. Presumably they were introduced by synesthetes into the language, but they stick around. And the reason they stick around is because we all get it. It makes sense to us. And presumably the reason it all makes sense to us is precisely because we all have those connections in our head. So I just want to mention, if anyone's interested in synesthesia, I've written a book on it called Wednesday is Indigo Blue. But more importantly, if you think you have synesthesia, go to synesthete.org and take those tests to see if you've got synesthesia. Okay, now in the last several minutes, I want to switch gears. I want to circle back around to what I started with, which is the complexity of the system. So So, there are whole laboratories that study what's going on at the molecular level or the neuronal level or systems of neurons. And what's always been my interest is how all the biological stuff maps onto behavior and perception and reality. And I've already mentioned that you are inseparable from this alien computational material. The reason I call it this is because the fact is we all feel like we know ourselves and how we make decisions and why we do what we do in life. But when we look under the hood, what we're looking at is this, completely foreign pink fabric that's it seems totally different than anything we know about. I mean, if an alien spaceship crashed into the Earth and we found it, we opened it up, and there was this weird, self-configuring, pink, self-healing fabric that could do incredible things, we would look at that and go, gosh, we'll never understand this, but that's what we find when we look inside of us. Now, I want to zoom back in on this point about, our behavior is inseparable from this. I'm going to assume most people here have heard of Phineas Gage, who was a young man who had an iron tamping rod blow through his head because of an explosion. It's a very famous medical case. This was in the 1880s. It's very famous for a few reasons. First is that he didn't die, which is unusual given a head injury like this. He didn't even lose consciousness. I don't know how many of you know that, but the first doctor to arrive on the scene didn't even believe the story that he was just told about what had happened, because Phineas Gage was standing there, and it was actually only when Gage leaned over and coughed and an old teaspoon of brain fell out onto the dust that the doctor realized the severity of what had happened. Okay, but the other main reason it was so famous is because Phineas Gage, his personality changed entirely. So people who knew him said, Gage is no longer Gage. He had been a good, hard worker on this railroad team. Everybody liked him. He was a nice kid. And then afterwards, he just became someone totally different. He took to gambling and cussing and sleeping with prostitutes. His risk aversion changed. Everything about him changed. And what's happened in the intervening 130 years is that we've now seen lots of cases like Gage, and they all point to the same lesson, which is that when your biology changes, so do you. So does your decision making. I'm curious how many people here know who this is. How many people know who Charles Whitman is? Anybody? Okay. So in 1966, Charles Whitman climbed to the top of the tower at UT Austin. And he dragged with him a trunk full of guns and knives and food, and he started indiscriminately shooting people. And he shot pedestrians below, he shot people who came to help them, he shot the ambulance drivers who came to help them, and in total he shot 39 people in an act of random violence. And he kept doing that until 4 deputies managed to get to the top of the tower and kill him. And when the police force went to his house right after this, trying to figure out who this was and what had just happened, they found that the night before he had killed his wife and his mother. And after he'd killed them, he had written what amounted to a suicide note. Now what he said is, something inside of me has been changing for the last year. I've had this anger, I've had irrational thoughts that I haven't been able to deal with. He actually went to a psychiatrist, but this was in the 1960s and there wasn't much that could be done. And he said, when this is all over, I want an autopsy to be performed. Now the thing is, the only thing stranger than the act itself was the fact that there was nothing about Charles Whitman that presaged this kind of behavior. He had a very high IQ. He'd been honorably discharged from the Marines. He worked as a bank teller and an engineering student. He was the leader of he was the leader of the Cub Scout troop there, but he had been an Eagle Scout himself. So what happened is there was an autopsy performed, and they lifted his brain from the vault of the skull, and what they discovered is that he had a brain tumor. He had a tumor in a part of his brain that was impinging on the what's called the amygdala, which is a part of the brain involved in fear and aggression. And this presumably is what had been changing inside of him and changed his behavior so drastically. So it turns out that cases like Gage or Charles Whitman are one of hundreds of cases we can find. I'll just give you one more example. This was in the medical literature just a few years ago. A 40-year-old man, normal sexual appetite, who started becoming more and more interested in pedophilia. It was sort of a sudden change. He started collecting child pornography, going to child porn websites. What happened is he made an inappropriate move on his prepubescent stepdaughter living in the home. The mother found out, had him arrested. And the night before his sentencing, he was having these worsening headaches. And so the night before sentencing, he went to the ER finally, and he said, I can't even sleep, my head hurts so bad. They did a scan on him, and what they found was a massive frontal lobe tumor. So here's a horizontal slice of his brain. This is the front here. And this white part here is a massive tumor. So what happened is the neurosurgeons resected the tumor, and his sexual appetite returned completely to normal. There's an interesting postscript to the story, because 6 months later, he started developing an interest in pedophilia again. So his wife took him back to the doctors. It turns out they had missed a part of the tumor, which was now regrowing. They resected it a second time, and again, his behavior returned completely normal. So what does this mean? It means you are your biology. You're not inseparable from your biology. And of course, people universally administer alcohol to change their personality, their behavior. People do drugs of all sorts. Does anyone know who this is? This is Chris Benoit, who was a worldwide wrestling federation champion. Went home one night, killed his wife and his son, and then hung himself from one of the pulleys of his weight machine. He was on massive doses of testosterone. He had conspired with his physician to have 8 times the normal level of testosterone, and he was having a roid rage. Medications also. How many people know what's happening with Parkinson's medications? It turns out that people on Parkinson's medications, these medications affect a neurotransmitter system called dopamine, which is involved in motor movement, but it also serves a double duty in the reward system. And so what happens when you change dopamine levels in the brain is it changes people's risk aversion. So these elderly people going on the Parkinson's medications are suddenly becoming pathological gamblers and going off to Vegas or Atlantic City and blowing their family's fortunes became a real problem. And so until this was discovered a few years after this new medication came out, and so now physicians are aware that this is one of the possible side effects, and they titrate the dosage to make sure that people don't have this pathological gambling behavior. So anyway, all of this is just serving the same point, which is that nowadays when we talk about morality and decision making, what we're really talking about is the neural basis of this. Okay, well this leads to a very deep and important question, which is a question about free will. So there's this old question about, is the mind separate from the brain, or does the mental equal the physical? And the examples that I just showed you, plus hundreds more, all seem to suggest that at minimum you are absolutely inseparable from the 3 pounds of wetware in between your ears. When that changes, you change. Okay, well, that turns out to have very deep implications for how we run our social policy. Because what does this mean for the notion of culpability? So the legal system as we have it now rests on 2 main premises. The first is that people are practical reasoners, and this is a term of art that means we are free to choose how we act. We get to make rational decisions, and in fact, it all runs on what's called the reasonable man standard, which is what would any reasonable person do in that situation? You have the capacity to make that choice. And related to this is the second assumption, which is that all brains are equal. As long as you're over 18 or over an IQ of 70, all brains are treated equally in the legal system. Well, that's a very charitable idea, but it's demonstrably false. It turns out that along any axis you measure brains, whether that's intelligence, or risk aversion, or aggression, or capacity to simulate possible futures and evaluate them, brains are very different. Brains come about as an intersection of your genetics and your environment, and that can send brains off on very different developmental trajectories. And as a result, all brains are like snowflakes. They're all totally different from one another. And so this idea that all brains are equal is a nice idea, but it's completely wrong. And so where the problem is that what we know in neurobiology is that it's a bad assumption. And the problem is what we do is we treat incarceration as a one-size-fits-all solution. So we assume, okay, well look, everybody has the same capacity to make decisions, the same brain going on fundamentally, you're all using your free will to do it. So if you've done something, we're going to make you hurt for it, and we're going to put you in jail and so on. Well, it turns out that's a very crude system. It's a very crude way of doing it. We know that prisons are criminogenic, meaning they cause more crime. So when you put someone in there, you break their social circles, you break their employment opportunities. Essentially, you're sending them to criminal school. That's their new social circle, and they're going to come back around. Okay. Now, how many people know? I'm just curious, by a show of hands, if you were to rank all the countries in the world and look at the percentage of population behind bars, who thinks America is in the top half and who thinks America is in the bottom half? So who thinks America is in the top half in terms of how many think it's in the bottom half? Okay. How about top quarter versus the next quarter? Okay, how many people think America is in the top 10% of countries? Okay, so I'm actually surprised this isn't more widely known. To me, this is one of the most striking things that everybody should know. America is #1 in the world for the percentage of our population behind bars. If you made a list of all the really bad countries in the world that you wouldn't want to be on a list with, we're #1 on that list. It's really embarrassing. And that's the situation we're in, is we're just incarcerating everybody. It's a completely broken system, and it's not effective. It's not cost effective, and it doesn't actually solve the problem. So this is essentially the heart of where we can start making change in the legal system. Now, one thing I want to make clear at the outset is, as we come to have better and better understanding of the biology of behavior, one thing people worry about right away is, oh, well, is that just going to let everybody off the hook? Does explanation equal exculpation? The answer is no. It's quite the opposite. What happens is it gives us the capacity to do rational sentencing and customized rehabilitation and understand how to structure incentives on a societal level. So instead of doing this crude ham-handed thing we do, just tossing everyone in jail, it allows us to make sentencing decisions based on estimations of future dangerousness. Because it turns out for the exact same crime, when there's a brain standing in front of the judge's bench, some brains are really worrisome. They're really rabid dogs, and you've got to put them away. Other brains, not so much, and everywhere in between. And it turns out there's a lot of data, which I didn't put any slides today, but I'd be happy to talk about that to any detail. There's a lot of data now telling us what factors you can measure that give you probabilities about future dangerousness. We'll never have 100% correlation because life's too complicated and crime is contextual. Nonetheless, you can separate out on a spectrum who's really dangerous and who's not so dangerous and everywhere in between, and modulate sentencing accordingly. Equally as importantly, we can really look to rehabilitative strategies. It turns out for a given crime, with given circumstances, there are 100 ways that a brain can get there to that moment, right? It can get there because of lots of different problems with the brain. Some of them we can help. Some of them we can't, unfortunately. Things like psychopathy, there's no rehabilitative strategy for. But for lots of other things, there are. For Charles Whitman with a brain tumor, it would have been easy to catch that early and so on. Alex the pedophile, for example. There are things that you can do for different people depending on what the problem is. Obviously, with many different mental illnesses, we have really good therapeutic approaches that can be leveraged there. As it stands now, 1/3 of our prison population has mental illness. What this means is that our prison system has become our de facto mental health care system. So this has to change. So this is what we can do with modern neurobiology. I'm not going into much detail at all, but what I'd like to point you to is newlaw.org. So this is the initiative that I direct. It's the initiative on neuroscience and law, and we address everything at the intersection of neuroscience and law. This includes, I just put a smattering of pictures here, this includes new technologies for lie detection. It includes things like the insanity defense, drug addiction, which is a big one. Because so many people here are interested in drug addiction, I'll just mention, we spend so many billions of dollars every year on the war on drugs, and probably everybody knows at this point it's a completely unwinnable war. Why is it unwinnable? It's because we're attacking the drug supply, and that means that's like a water balloon. If you press down the drug supply in one place, it'll come up somewhere else. We'll never win that. If you want to address the drug problem, you have to address drug demand, and that's the brain of the addict. And at this point, we know so much about the circuitry and pharmacology of drug addiction. There are so many techniques that people are pursuing to help drug addiction that way. That's the only way we're going to crack the problem. If anyone's interested in that, I have a recent paper called Why Neuroscience Matters for a Rational Drug Policy. Eyewitness identification, how jurors make decisions. That's the other half of the equation, the brain of the juror. These are all examples of what the initiative is doing experiments on and researching. I'll just mention one example, just so there's one specific example before closing, which is one of the things we're working on is new strategies for rehabilitation, so we don't have to treat jail as a one-size-fits-all. How's it going to work? Well, I have to tell you take a step back and tell you one thing, which is the law refers to the mind, like, in the Guilty Act test. It asks if anything's in the way, interfering with the ability of the mind to control the body, and so on. But one of the themes that I really press on in my book Incognito is that you don't have just one mind. There's not a single you. Instead, the right way to think about the brain is like a representative democracy. You have essentially a bunch of political parties in there that are always battling it out to control the ship of state. What you have are different networks that have overlapping domains, specializations essentially, and they're always battling to control what you do. This is why if I were to stick some warm chocolate chip cookies in front of you, part of your brain wants to eat it, it's a high energy source, part of your brain says don't eat it, you're going to get fat, part of your brain says okay, I'll eat it, but I'll go to the gym tomorrow. And this is why you can fight with yourself and argue with yourself and feel conflicted. It's because you're not just one thing. Okay, well this is a very important door for new sorts of rehabilitative strategies. So one of the things we're doing is taking people who, let's say, want to quit drugs, but they haven't been able to. So part of their brain knows they want to quit, and part of their brain can't resist the temptation when it's faced with that. So we're starting this with cigarette smokers. We're using what's called real-time feedback and fMRI. Here's the way this works. The person's lying in the scanner. We're scanning their brain, and on the fly, doing really cutting-edge computational decisions to change what they're seeing on the screen. So here's an example. You're lying in the scanner, you're trying to quit cigarette smoking. We show you pictures of cigarette smokers. We're able to analyze what's going on in your brain on the fly. And what we do is we can pull out the networks in your brain that are involved in craving. So when you're craving that cigarette, we can figure out what the networks are in your brain that are involved in that craving. We now represent those networks by a bar on the screen, and your job is to make that bar go down. So you surf through your mental space and you figure out what you need to do to reduce the craving in those networks, in your brain in particular. You may or may not have conscious access to what you're doing, but nonetheless you figure out what do you need to do to manipulate that, to make your craving decrease. You practice that over and over and over. And this is what I call the prefrontal gym, because what you're doing is essentially strengthening those parts of your brain that are involved in impulse control, in taking control of those impulses that you have. What's nice about this is that it's only going to work for people who want to change. I'm a libertarian, so I don't like the idea of a government being able to come up with ways to muck with their citizens' brains. But what's nice about this is that this is a participatory rehabilitative strategy that can be used. What we're doing right now is stuffing our prisons with people with drug problems. That's got to change, and here's a very specific way that I'm going to be able to offer to the legal system an alternative to what they're doing right now. The last thing I'll say about neuro law is, this is from Whitman's suicide note. He said, if my life insurance policy is valid, please pay off my debts, donate the rest anonymously to a mental health foundation. Maybe research can prevent further tragedies of this type. He was incredibly insightful into what was going on with him. So the last thing I'll say is, I started off this talk talking about how much we don't have access to under the hood, and sometimes people think of that as sort of a dethronement of us from the center. We're not really the ones driving the boat as much as we think. And of course, the last great dethronement was in the early 1600s when Galileo discovered we were not at the center of the orbits of the universe, but in fact we were orbiting the sun, which is itself on the outer reaches of the Milky Way. And so that's the same situation we find ourselves in now, but the really nice part is there's always an upside to dethronements, which is that we discover things are much more incredible than we ever thought. With Galileo, we discovered that our Milky Way has 100 billion suns in it, and it's one of 100 billion other galaxies. The whole thing is so much greater and more subtle and wondrous than we could have ever thought, and that's exactly what's happening in neuroscience. As we sail into the inner cosmos, what we're finding is that it's much more wondrous and subtle than we ever imagined. And so that's where we are. And thanks very much for your time and attention.